All right. Hi there, everyone. This is Alan Shark and Doug Robinson, and this is our annual state and local government tech forecast, What Lies Ahead. This is probably our 11th or 12th year. I'm losing touch on which it is, but we've been doing this for quite a while. It's become known favorably as the Doug and Alan Show. And we share our insights based on research and things that we hear in the field. So we're very excited to join you starting a new year, 2023. Although I'm sure many of you feel that this year is well established, it doesn't feel as new anymore, even though we're not even halfway into the first month. But many of you know that Doug Robinson and I started at the same time in our respective organizations. Doug with NASCIO, myself with PTI, which since has come under the flag of CompTIA. So we're both going to share our insights today, as we normally have done for the last dozen years. And then we're going to hopefully leave enough time for questions and answers. The session is being recorded. We are happy to make our slide decks available and the recording available for those who have registered. I'm excited to say that we have well over 500 people that have pre-registered. So there really is interest in all of this, and much is happening. So I'm really excited to share these insights, and I'm going to turn it over to Doug and let you take it from there. Doug.
Alan, thank you very much. And let me go ahead and jump right in here and share my screen, and we'll talk about the state of the states. So I'm going to take you through a quick journey of what's going on in state IT, and of course, going to start with most importantly, the state CIO top 10. So let me go ahead and move quickly through that to give you some updates. This is something that NASCIO has been doing since 2006. We do a forced choice ballot among the state CIOs late in the calendar year, in this case, December, release this top 10 for 2023. And you'll see some, for those of you familiar with this is probably our most important kind of one-page message to the marketplace, public sector or private sector colleagues and partners as to what the state CIOs see as their top priorities and their strategies for the upcoming year. So kind of this is their prognostication. We take all the individual data and the scores, put it in the NASCIO blender, and give you the aggregate view of the world for the next year or so. So again, this is their individual forecast. Number one, not surprisingly, cybersecurity and risk management, number one, 10th consecutive year that has been number one. So it's been on the list since the inception of our top 10. However, this again remains as the top priority for the state CIOs. Digital services, again, stays in the same location in number two. Couple of the more surprising moves. Workforce moves up dramatically up to the number 3 slot. We'll talk a lot today about the state IT workforce and some of the challenges as I prepare the rest of my remarks for you all. Cloud services remains, again, top. Consolidation optimization, again, has been on the list for many, many years. It was number one for several years. I think with that in cloud, I think both represents the maturity and the movement and the adoption going on across the state CIO community and the state IT community. So that's important to note. Broadband and wireless has dropped a little bit, and we can certainly talk about that and the rationale, but with $65 billion on the table, there's a lot of activity going on with the federal funding and broadband expansion, particularly covering those rural areas, digital divide issues, and digital equity. Those are big topics with the state CIOs. What is conspicuous by its absence again this year in 2023 is budget and cost control. So I think that reflects the fiscal condition of the states. All but one state really projecting revenue above projections, or in a record revenue projection area for most of the states for this fiscal year. They're also showing high spend in most states. So that's going to occur even with the prospects of potential recession for 2023 through the end of June for most states' fiscal year. They're still showing above projected revenue. So that's good. And many, many states showing record surpluses that they'll be moving to their rainy day funds. So if you kind of look at the overall landscape real quick, this is the general themes that we're seeing across the states, and we'll talk about that in a minute. A little bit more focus on digital services, citizen-centric, using human-centric design. Identity management is a big component of that. You saw identity and access management up there in the top 10. That is getting a lot more attention in 2023. We'll talk a little bit about cyber threats, and particularly around whole of state cyber resiliency, cooperating with local governments, with higher education, with utilities, with healthcare. Those are all the major components of a whole of state resiliency, moving on from simply the focus on the executive branch of state government to a whole of government or whole of state model. And certainly that's promoted in a number of the grant programs as well. As I mentioned, 2023, year of workforce. You see the 5 R's in there. That will continue to be a focus, and particularly acute in the IT space. Reskilling and retraining is going to be kind of a focus, because states are finding it increasingly problematic to hire new candidates into those positions. A number of states have reported 50 to 60% reductions in the actual candidate pools for state positions across the board. We mentioned in our abstract for this event the Cybersecurity Improvement Grant Program, the state and local from CISA, being administered by FEMA. That's a $1 billion 4-year grant program. We are in year 1 of that, which was $200 million minus the overhead administrative, is about $180 million to be distributed to the states. The notice of funding opportunity came out in September. Applications from the states were due mid-November. Those applications are in. The states are now kind of storming and forming and doing their organizing. They will have to submit a plan. About 10 states have done that, and then we'll be prepared to provide 80% of those funds that each state gets to local governments in one way or another. And some of that may be through enterprise shared services rather than direct grants to the locals. Human investments in broadband, as I mentioned, $65 billion alone in federal dollars, and other states that are putting in tens of millions of their own funds into broadband. And again, trying to look at certainly better data around that, and more consistent mapping across the states. And I know what all of you are interested in is the transition. So 36 gubernatorial elections in 2022 resulted in 9 new governors. As of yesterday, all of them have been inaugurated. We also have 1,500 new legislators. So what are we going to expect? Let me do a quick review of where we stand in terms of state CIO transitions. This is the end of 2022. So at the end of the calendar year, you can see all those states where we had a state CIO transition, 13, which is about typical, around 10 to 11 transitions each year in a non-gubernatorial election year. And so we had a couple of folks that left early. But again, you can see where we stand in terms of the states that have new CIOs at the end of 2022. A number of these were acting or interim CIOs, I must note. So we're still dealing with the fallout of that. And then, of course, when you look at the new state CIOs that have come in since 2023, you see the 5 states that are highlighted. And we've got just actually last Friday notifications of permanent CIOs being named in Vermont and Maryland, with a new administration in Maryland, a new one in Massachusetts. We'll see some change. We've had a few party flips, and so this may shake out more, but right now this is where we stand in terms of this day in January for the new CIOs. I would fully expect to see some additional changes even within states that have not had an election where the incumbent was reelected. That often happens. You see that situation here depicted in both Illinois and Kansas, where we have incumbent CIOs that prevailed, but the state CIOs decided to step down early in January and pursue other interests. So again, we'll continue to monitor this, and you'll see some changes there. And then let's quickly run through some of the comments from our state CIO survey in 2022 about kind of looking at the future over the next couple of years. And you can see the data that we've collected longitudinally since 2020 about the impact of the pandemic and some of the adjustments that have taken place. In 2020, there was a high focus on expanded work, remote work, use of collaboration platforms. They were number one or number two, and you can see the shift that has occurred over time. And I think that's a reflection of some of the challenges that states had during the pandemic around digital services delivery, the challenges around citizens using some of the online services, finding them clunky, finding them not streamlined, finding them not really advantageous from a consumer perspective. And so high focus on improving the citizen experience. That's a major phone that the whole CX experience was poor, and a lot of states are focused on improving that. And that's clearly top of mind for the state CIOs, along with increased investments in some of the legacy platforms that were exposed for their challenges during the pandemic. So you see that has moved up from number 5 to number 2 for the current forecast for the next couple of years. We could look at the same thing around the CIO organizations and what they're doing. We've seen these evolving trends for several years, the movement from the standard kind of owner-operator models, we described it, to much more CIO or broker, and what CIOs are going to do. More consolidation of infrastructure, more use of software as a service, more use of cloud, more use of centralization of the project and portfolio management. So this will continue to see over half the states are focused on a number of those things. And I think a key part of this is application modernization and just kind of rationalizing the current application portfolio that states have. That's particularly, I think, acute in some of the legacy modernization efforts, is having a good inventory of your applications across the board, having the CIO having visibility in the agency applications that are making investment decisions based on what they can triage, really focused on that. And so that's an important consideration for many states. You look at their application portfolio, and over half the states would describe that as legacy needing modernization. That's I think their aspiration is they need to invest in those. And I mentioned workforce being the theme for 2023. I guess great quote from one of our state CIOs in our 2022 survey. That survey was actually titled, it is titled The People Imperative. And using the old kind of moniker, build people, not systems. Many CIOs have seen this as a critical component of their digital transformation, is they're going to have to focus on talent and getting the workforce component right, because that kind of a huge issue. We've got a couple of examples here from the data around our number of questions in our survey around workforce. We've talked about compensation as always being a challenge, but if we hold for compensation and basically ask the question, what actions could the states take, you can see that most of the CIOs want to focus on reskilling, and they want to talk about modernizing job titles and job descriptions that more closely align to the marketplace. Data processing specialist 1, information technology specialist 2. These are common titles that are used in state government. They don't really mean anything to the marketplace. It's very difficult to attract, kind of young talent into that with those types of titles. Increasing the remote options came into the mix, and of course that wasn't even discussed in 2019. So that's going to be a component of this, and again, that's a challenge for many states, is promoting the remote work from home, and also working from other states. So the borderless hiring is certainly a preference for some state CIOs, but it's very difficult to do that. So that's some of the things that the state CIOs are going to be targeting in the next couple of years, particularly around improving the process, but also trying to get some legislative relief on some of these constraints that don't allow them to have a flexible and modern workforce. And just as one example of that, when we queried our state CIOs and asked about the major challenges in meeting the demand for digital services, as you can see, that was a number 2 priority. That's something that they all aspire to do in terms of improving the citizen experience. You can see 2/3 of them talked about the workforce skills and the capability constraints that they have to deliver. So they don't have the requisite skills, capabilities, and disciplines within their state IT workforce to meet again, that the vision they have for improving citizen experience. So that's something to keep in mind, is that as states look at this, there's a number of things that they have to overcome, and certainly the primary one, as we see, is the capabilities of the workforce. Let's look a little bit at, take a quick pivot here to cyber, as something obviously that NASCIO talks about a lot, and that is the current cybersecurity posture, as well as the adoption of cybersecurity frameworks and disciplines within the states, and controls, and everything the states are doing to try to constantly minimize the impact of adverse cybersecurity events. And what you'll see here, of course, in 2022, if you look at the comparison over 2020, this is our biennial survey of state chief information security officers. 53 of those responded, remarkable response rate. It's a very long survey, lots of data. So I provided you just a couple of snapshots and you can see what are their major constraints, again, around the legacy environment. But, 3 of these have to do with inadequate availability of professional, their staffing. They're concerned about the competencies of their own staff, but they're obviously concerned about the numbers. So we have seen increases in funding. Our survey looked at that data, and we have seen states that have actually been able to move the ball since 2020 and seen increases in the percentage available to cyber. So that's a very positive sign. And we've seen certainly continuation of stronger governance models and articulating that cybersecurity is a business risk to state government, and that's they're getting more traction, kind of explaining that to executive level folks in the executive branch as well as legislators. Few changes here in terms of what are the cyber threats. Again, we've certainly seen a lot in the last couple of years around ransomware and the impact of ransomware. You see a little bit of an uptick there about the CISO concern, but it remains, again, top of the list in terms of their cyber threats. And then phishing and farming and all those other activities that are targeted to individuals, who employees and contractors. I think there's been a substantial effort on part of the states and their contractors to really work on the employee training and to do anti-phishing campaigns and to really focus on that, because that's a major gateway to the threat landscape, is phishing directed at state employees and contractors. So seeing a lot of emphasis on that among the state chief information security officers. And again, the other threats that you can see here have been pretty prominent for the last 5 or 6 years. It's just a constant movement up and down from the threat actors, both domestic and foreign. We've seen a lot of increase, particularly in those foreign threat actors. And they're constantly pushing out disinformation campaigns around the public sector. And that's something we have to be vigilant about. And then finally, in terms of what states are doing foundationally, you can see the 3 major buckets in terms of what they're focused on. And that is really their overarching cybersecurity strategy, having an enterprise strategy for the executive branch for cybersecurity, promoting, again, a more consolidated and centralized organizational model for cyber, multi-factor authentication. We have a number of states that have deployed multi-factor solutions across the entire executive branch of state government, providing that to tens of thousands of employees. And they're also doing risk assessments. And all of these will be supported by the cybersecurity grant program for the next several years. A number of these elements are requirements in that, particularly multi-factor and risk assessments. The cybersecurity strategy and the plan needs to be submitted to CISA for review. So all 3 of these are prominent requirements in the cybersecurity grant program over the next 4 years. So that states will be focused on these. You see some of the trends. Again, not surprisingly, cybersecurity talent crisis with recruitment, retention, keeping that talent inside the state, getting to become more whole of state models, more organizational changes, always monitoring remote work because you've increased the attack surface dramatically. The states can't do too much about the software supply chain risk at the moment. That's a very complex area, but they're working with their providers, obviously, to make sure they have better forensics about their software supply chain. And then finally, supporting local governments. This is something that Alan and I have talked about for years, or what states are doing, what can they do, what should they do. A lot of conversation. That is a major component of the cybersecurity grant program, is the pass-through grants to local governments, and then working collaboratively with them, having them part of the governance model and the planning committee, and getting inputs from them. So in that vein, we did ask our CIOs in 2022 in our survey, what are the current services that are offered to local governments? And you can see the table here, the matrix of the wide variety of services. And then, of course, the ones that were represented at the top with network services and data center hosting, kind of the traditional infrastructure activities that you would expect. These have been offered for many, many years by states. Cybersecurity, security services, assessments, those have all moved up of the list in recent years in terms of what states are offering to local governments. I think you see across the board in 2022 somewhat of a decline of those services that are being offered to local governments. That represents probably less attractive take rates by some of the locals in some of these areas, that they invest in their own services, their own infrastructure, including going to third parties and moving to that model where the local governments are using more managed services, more outsourced services. And certainly Alan can speak to that. And then finally, what are the challenges? And you can see a lot of this has to do with just organizational understanding. I think there's continues to be less of an effort on marketing and education from the state side. That's something that we've really advocated for, is the states need to take more of a role in getting the word out to the locals. But many states also say we don't have the authority. We don't have the requisite statutory authority to work closely with our local governments and provide these services, and we don't have enough funding to do that. So that's some of the challenges that have to be overcome. We may see some more progress and collaboration with this grant program on how to do that more effectively. And my final comments are just a wrap up of some of the major topics to watch for in 2023. I mentioned the cybersecurity grant. There's still a lot of work to be done before the next guidance comes out for fiscal year 23 and 24. States will be focused on activities around the future workforce. We are working on a set of recommendations for the cyber workforce, a report that will come out probably in the next couple of months, and looking at some of the things that states are doing. CIOs will be continually focused on reducing that diversity and complexity of their environment, because they know that they're not going to get dramatically more funding. They may have more funding than they've had in the past with the current fiscal conditions, but that will always change. We're in a kind of a bright area right now, but states know that they always have to be prepared for the next downturn. And so with the operating model with state CIOs, they're always cautious about their major investments and being a little bit more conservative. And I think one of those things is really focusing on how to rationalize their current environment as they look to capital expenses or capital dollars for additional expansion. So one of the topics that came out of the pandemic was program integrity, benefits fraud, application fraud. So that's something that CIOs are hearing from legislative bodies and state auditors, as they got to work with their business partners in the agencies to improve program integrity, perhaps roll out identity verification, enterprise-wide identity and access management solutions, and really promote anti-fraud sharing, data analytics, data sharing around what's going on. And last point I'll make is we've seen a lot of interest in the last couple of years with privacy. We have states that have introduced new privacy legislation, a lot of that being modeled after California's privacy legislation. So we have that as being a hot legislative topic in the information technology area for 2023. We host the community of practice for the state chief privacy officers. And again, we're seeing a growth in that position as well, either reporting to the CIO or reporting to independently in some other unit in the executive branch. All of the data that I talked about in more depth and more details available on the NASCIO site on a resource page. All of this is available free to you. There's no paywalls. You can download this and look through this at your heart's content and put any other questions that you have in the chat. And so, Alan, that's a quick run by for me on the state side. So to you to cover the local government landscape.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Let me get my slide deck back. I think what always amazes me or not is the fact that the issues that Doug has identified and the things that we've identified really align. Maybe a number 4 to 7 may vary somewhat, but they are very much similar. So for those of you not as familiar with PTI, we've been around for some 50 some odd years, I think 56, formed in 1971. And our mission has always been to assist the cities and counties and townships in the country. And there are many of us, and it's very hard to necessarily say this represents a pure trend because of the pure variety of size of different organizations. So I've tried my best with staff help and many of our members in our executive committee to kind of look at our digital crystal ball and look ahead. So we do 2 studies a year. One is our state and county IT national survey. The other is our cyber survey. So because they coincide at different times of the year, I'm going to share with you a little bit of both and then share some overall results based on some focus groups that we've had. When we did our last national study, the next one will come out probably in April, the top city county CIO technology priorities for the next 2 years, because there is an horizon here. It's more limited than a year. Obviously, between NASCIO and PTI, cybersecurity is number one. I suspect it'll be number one for years and years to come. But all the years we've been doing it, it's always number one. But there's greater pressure, and it's related. All these issues are related, is modernizing outdated IT systems. Much of this was exposed during the pandemic. There seems to be a renewal to look back at innovation and what it means to do things different, look at process improvement. Number 4 was launching or updating digital services for citizens, again, hastened by the experience of the pandemic. And then migrating systems and applications to the cloud. There are many reasons for it, and between this and the cyber study, I think there is a trend that emerges that kind of trumps over that. That's very, very important, especially for those of you in the vendor community. Addressing integrating different systems, addressing data silos, and streamlining procurement processes. And then still COVID-specific initiatives remain in terms of healthcare, knowing more about our citizens and more citizen-facing technologies. So going back to December, every year I do a piece, every month I do a piece for American City County Magazine, and I did the 10 predictions. Now last year I did 12, and I did a recap, and most of the ones we identified last year basically came true. This year, there's more uncertainty. So the first one, in terms of this year and what we see, cybersecurity is number 1. Cyber insurance and security is number 2. So these 10 predictions are couched in an area of insecurity with some bits of hope and opportunity. But cyber insurance was something that has been looked upon over the years as something, do we have to have it? Should we have it? We must have it. And now it's, can we afford it? Can we even qualify? We're hearing many small local governments having to fill out forms. 2 years ago, it might be 8 pages, then it became 11 pages. One county executive told me it's now something like 22 pages. And filling out the form does not necessarily mean you're going to get cyber insurance. The other thing that's happened is now that the insurance companies have more of a track record of what their payouts are, then they naturally have to adjust to the market. And I'm not faulting them. And so what they have done is they have increased premiums, they've made it more difficult to qualify, and they've decreased coverage. And that puts a tremendous burden back on local governments. So there's a lot of cyber insurance insecurity, forcing many to either forego it or to self-insure, or a combination of the two. Here's where the muni pools, where many states have these municipal pools, can really help. Number 3, tech staffing and security continues. This has continued to move up the list. 6 years ago, I don't believe, Doug, this was on your list, not at least in the top 10. About 6 years ago, 5 years ago, it started to emerge at the bottom. It's worked its way up. This, to some people at the local government level, say this is their number 2 problem. Either cybersecurity being number 1, but related is getting the staff, keeping the staff, providing the right incentives, and little things like giving them the appropriate titles to give them something that is marketable, something that makes them feel better about what they're doing. I'm always amazed how people continue to hold back and say, well, those are our civil service rules. And I say there's a difference between salary classifications and what the public sees. The enlightened organizations recognize that and are giving some flexibility. So not everything costs more, but tech staffing and security continues. And that leads us to number 4, managed service provider and security. 2 fronts here. On one hand, you're going to see that cloud computing continues to grow in local governments for a whole host of reasons. But that's kind of coupled with this MSP dilemma, in that local governments who are unable to attract the and train the staff that they need are going to be turning more and more this year and for years to come to MSPs. So from an MSP standpoint, that's good news. The bad news, there's a certain amount of reluctance. Who do we turn to? How do we know that they're going to do a better job that we could do? And what kind of cybersecurity protections can they offer? We've heard of a number of cases, one somewhat recently, where there was another supply chain issue where the local entity had no idea that their service provider was providing an update that had infected data, and therefore their system was compromised. So the good news is we have organizations like StateRAMP, which I am a strong supporter of, that is now going to be certifying a place to look for if you are StateRAMP approved, certified, and there's different levels. That gives someone a tool they didn't have before. And then dialing back to CompTIA, they're creating a trust mark. And there's something like 400 MSPs that are on the waiting list. They are so excited to go through this, and all these things map back to CSI controls. So there is some help on the way. Number 5, zero trust ID management in security. We still don't know where all our equipment is. And when we talk about asset management, people say boring, but this is important. We cannot manage what we don't know, and we don't know where it is. So we've got to move back to a zero trust mentality, not necessarily absolute, because that locks out some of the better features of our internet today. And ID management in security has to do with tightening up who has access to what. Access control is critical, and that's why zero trust and ID management go together. More needs to be done there. Customer-facing technologies, of course, the demand came from the pandemic. That continues, and people like it. They don't want that to go away. So there will be more pressure to provide more services that are 24/7 and online. Augmented AI and robotics. People say, oh, that's not really here. It is here. Our citizens are talking to chatbots, and they are saving local governments money, filling in and augmenting deficiencies or providing service on off hours, peak loads, and on weekends. This stuff is getting highly intelligent all the time. It's a little scary, but at this time in 2023, humans are still in charge, but we're relying more and more on office process automation, helping us get rid of some of the more tedious tasks, maybe even dangerous tasks, and assigning them to the machines. And so far, the machines have not complained. So we'll see more of that. Blockchain for trust. This is something that's been bobbling around for a while. I think Cook County was one of the first jurisdictions to actually develop blockchain on their own. In fact, it was homegrown, and they did it for their Records and Deeds Office. Now people are experimenting with databases and possibly even elections because people are distrustful. And here is a way to make databases less alterable. I hate to use the word inalterable, but less alterable. In other words, safer, more secure. Blockchain as a matter of record is here to stay, and I think it will be perfected. Broadband access continues to grow because when it comes to localities, we are the first in line to interface with the public. I think the pandemic just highlighted what already existed, but it amplified it 10 times, 100 times more for students that had to, go to a parking lot, maybe a library if they were lucky to get broadband to help them complete their homework. So broadband will continue. I think a Pew study about a year and a half ago polled a good sampling of Americans saying, should broadband even be a utility? And something like 75% said yes. It is so important to our ability to communicate with our citizens and residents. And the number 10, data analytics will explode. We are expected to do more. And this couples with this smart city movement, which I've been part of in the early days. I know many people have traveled to Barcelona, and many people just came back from another such event where smart cities really got its global name. I was there for one of the first ones. Data drives smart, intelligent applications. We're going to need to break down these data silos. We need more data governance, better data management. So these are really the 10 predictions of where the focus of many of our CIOs will be. So we held a focus group, and they said, wait, there are 4 more. So I said, okay, we will add them. System modernization. there is still a lot of old systems out there that need to be modernized and that need to be able to talk to each other. In some cases, this will force people to make a decision. Are we near the end of life of our system? And if so, should we now move to the cloud? And the answer is probably. So I think we're going to see much more cloud migration. And again, I repeat, many more people are going to have to turn to MSPs. Number 12, continuous business process improvement. It really is about process, people, and systems. We need to do a better job. Number 13 is digital transformation, taking all those analog records, taking all these outdated systems and turning them into something that makes more sense to the end user, including colleagues and other governments. And number 14, greater reliance on outside services. They just stress this over and over again. We no longer can do it alone. Many organizations lack the political will. Now, this is the political part of local government to put more money into these things. And so they're going to have to figure out ways to reach out to others who might be able to offer the services at a higher level and possibly at a cost that is more sustainable. So that takes us to our cybersecurity national study that just completed at the end of the year. So this is more current than when I began this little presentation. Of course, the big question is your cybersecurity budget. How has it changed compared to last year? Well, most of it has increased, which is 70%. That is good news. And only 20% stayed the same, but 3% decrease. So I guess we should be happy for the higher numbers and feel sorry for the 3%. But here we ask, is your cybersecurity budget adequate to support security and cloud initiatives? 63% said no. So while spending has increased overall, there still is not enough based on the experts in the field to accomplish what they have mapped out. Then we asked an important question because political support at the local level is very important. How engaged are your elected officials with regards to your organization's cybersecurity efforts in particular? The good news is 61% were very engaged. The bad news is that 19% were somewhat engaged, but 20% were not engaged at all. So this is kind of a telling graph in the sense it gives you a sense of what CIO at the local level is facing, the kind of pressures to kind of argue for things when those at the top are not involved and perhaps don't realize the magnitude of the seriousness and the magnitude of not funding what can happen. In terms of information sharing and training, is this working? And the answer is 39% said excellent, 49% said fair, and 11% said poor. So this gets back to, we have a problem, I think, with resource sharing. And we have to do a better job of figuring out how do we work more closely together with all these other units, including state government. That's one thing that Doug mentioned, and there's no disagreement here. We have advocated for closer cooperation, but it takes more than just a desire. It takes a mandate. Many state CIOs have, they're supporting the executive branch. They don't have the staff. And I have talked to many, many state CIOs over the years, and it's not for lack of not wanting to. And there have been a number of cases, at least in the cyber field, where people have just done amazing work. They did it because, quote unquote, it was the right thing to do. So I'm hoping that this $1 billion grant, although I've been very critical because of the fact that there are 4 numbers that drive me nuts. There's a 4, a 7, and a 15. There are 4 core areas and 7 sub areas, and you have to touch 15 other areas from which to make sure your applications touch all the boxes. To me, the shortcoming of the current round is that while what we see in the current rules, soon to be updated, is more of a focus on checking off the boxes. It is an example of best practices at its very best, and it is totally, on the other hand, divorced from how local governments actually operate. So there's a big delta here, an enormous gap between how you have to go through the hoops and how do you get what you really need. And so this is something that I think is going to plague us for a while. My hope is, as Doug alluded to, at least the planning process is the right direction. The idea the federal government is becoming more involved, yes. But the focus has got to be whole of government and a statewide whole of government effort that includes local governments. I've proposed many times that every state should be broken into regions. There should be a regional coordination office under the CIO or CISO at every state. They can be put together differently because every state operates somewhat differently, but at least set up a mechanism of governance that does not formally exist today. Unless we have those structures, we're going to be going back asking for more money, and I'm afraid too many are going to be totally left out. So if we look at cybersecurity priorities over the next 2 years, it is cybersecurity prevention loss. These dovetail nicely with the earlier projections, modernizing, innovating, updating digital services, migrating systems and applications to the cloud, addressing integrating disparate systems, addressing the data silos, streamlining procurement processes where they can, and kind of dealing with the remaining COVID type initiatives. So with that, we want to open this up to questions. For those of you who are academics, I'm really proud that my latest textbook just came out this week, but it's a textbook. This is not a read, but if you have trouble sleeping at night, this might be for you, available at Amazon. And then for those who want more, including this broadcast, Shark Bites is the podcast that I do that comes out every other week. So at this point, if you dial into CompTIA podcast, you'll get to hear them in terms of lessons of tech leaders. So with that, we would love to entertain questions. We've left a bit of time. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen and hear the kind of questions that you might have. And if you could just put them in the chat area, that would be most helpful.
Alan, it looks like you've got a question in the chat from Kunal about the cloud migration.
There is a relationship. I guess I wasn't as clear. Yeah, thanks for that. More people are moving to the cloud because of the economics. There are forces. One is economics. One is they're not feeling good about the replacement that's available. In many cases, they don't have a choice. The kinds of applications they're looking for are now only being offered on a subscription basis and usually cloud related. The second driving force is the idea of trying to find the right staff to maintain things on premise. And that's becoming a challenge. So you have that. So these forces are forcing people into cloud migration, and hopefully this will be a remedy for some of the legacy systems that can possibly be better addressed through more modern systems that reside elsewhere.
Question from Chris on zero trust. I can address that at least from the state side. We're in the early implementation. A couple of years ago, I think some states started down that journey. High degree of interest. Looking at what's going on, obviously at the federal level with the executive order requiring zero trust. Had a number of conversations with the federal government, with the federal CISO around the monitoring of zero trust adoption. I think it is much more challenging at the state level. The federal level, their requirements are adoption of the zero trust framework within your domain, within the Department of the Interior, within the Department of Agriculture. With state government, zero trust is going to be, again, enterprise across the executive branch of all the diversity of the stovepipes that you have. So a little bit more complex. We do have a number of states that have embarked on a zero trust framework adoption. Again, not a technology, but an approach. I think the key thing here for most states, if you look at any of the persistent models, and some have more than 5, some have 7 or 8 kind of pillars, but the critical pillar is identity management. And that's something the states are going to have to really wrestle with to get zero trust across, all of their different agencies. Is how do we roll out a really robust, reliable identity and access management solution so we can be trusted at least on the individual side for applications and data.
I see a question that kind of comes back to one of the things I mentioned about automation and automation first for CIOs. Yeah, I think they are clearly looking at that, just like, off-the-shelf software. I think they're looking for ways in which to automate as much as they can. But you can say that. And I know many people, whether you call it digital transformation, automation first, it still requires people. And it requires a very close relationship with the vendor community. I think the biggest shift that has occurred since the pandemic is the cooperation, the high level of cooperation between local governments, I am going to say state governments too, and the vendor community. It has never been better. We have just been amazed and heartened by the amazing outpouring of cooperation during the pandemic from March 20. It was just unbelievable, where people were donating equipment, training, and the like. That continues to this day up to a point. I mean, obviously companies have to make a living, but it's going to require some partnerships. It's going to require educating many of the elected leaders, because we are very much dependent on people at the local level who very much, in some cases, do want to do more, but they say, quote, either their hands are tied politically or their hands are tied economically. So it is a very difficult dilemma. And that's why I'm heartened on one hand about the cyber funding, because it is a first step into channeling money. 80% is supposed to be designated for local governments, and a chunk of that, 20% for rural areas. That to me is a step in the right direction. I think they're off to a bad start in some ways, but you got to start somewhere. And you have to start with a planning process. That to me is probably the strongest part in it, and just outlining all the things that people should be striving for. But if you focus on just checking off boxes, you got to try. We have to be checking off people. We have to have a human network of the willing that's constantly in touch, which happens in some states, but not on a systematic, organized manner. So that's why I'm a strong advocate for cyber governance at the state level that includes local governments.
Question on state government and local tracking successes. We have actually written a number of reports that I'm familiar with on state and local collaboration and overcoming, as he's already mentioned, one of the most problematic areas is the governance, and the other one is the funding. And I think the funding simply because of the CIO business models. Overwhelmingly across the states, CIOs operate in a chargeback fee to services to their agency customers. And in most cases, more than 2/3 of the states, that's 100% chargebacks. So they don't have any additional supplemental funding. They don't have any general fund appropriations to provide for some flexibility to be able to do that. So that's a constraint. Again, back to Alan made the point about they may desire to have that with the local governments, but they don't have the capability to do it financially or within their statutory authority to be able to spend those dollars. But I think we've seen some really good examples in the cybersecurity space. A couple of years ago, released a report called Stronger Together with the National Governors Association, and that outlines a series of steps that states should take to collaborate better in the cybersecurity space, and also highlights with some use cases, states like Texas and Wisconsin and others that have done a really good job about building that collaboration with their local communities. North Carolina is another good example. They have a standing group with their local governments around cybersecurity. So they've really embraced the whole of state model. So there's lots of examples around there, around the states, that what they can do to assist with their local government counterparts and have them as part of a collaborative effort. And with that, all of these things were before there was even an announcement of a federal grant program. So these were being done in collaboration with the state, the local jurisdictions, without any additional funding from the federal government.
Doug, I see there's a question about office automation. I have a take on that, but do you want to take that one too?
Yeah, I think that I think the probably in terms of emerging technologies, you've got a couple of things going on in the states that are again driven by a pandemic experience. One is a much higher adoption and regard of robotic process automation, using bots, using scripts. So there's more of that going on. We have several states that have actually created centers of excellence for process automation. So I see that becoming a core part of the CIO portfolio. So I agree. I think that's an important component. Low code, no code continues to get lots of attention in the states as kind of an element of that. But I think, in terms of pure artificial intelligence, no, states aren't there yet, but certainly in terms of routine process automation. I see that being a big part of that discussion. And again, the question on the table for a lot of CIOs is: Are we the driving force for the agencies behind that? In some cases, it's mixed, where the agencies are actually bringing those to the state and the CIO organization. That's going to require more partnership, as you mentioned, Alan, with our private sector providers.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did not. I hear often I did not know this existed, or I did not know what to ask. And so, when you look at the local government landscape, our guess is that 35% of most jurisdictions have 5 or less people operating all of IT. And many of them, it's a 2-person operation. In some jurisdictions, it's totally outsourced with a county manager or a township manager. And that is probably more typical than not. And people don't realize that they just don't have the expertise. We did a survey a while back and we asked, how much time do you have to plan? And, a simple little question like that. And the answers were all over the map, but mostly it was like 10%, 8%, a shockingly low number. And the reason is understaffed. They're doing everything. They're wearing all these different hats, being called upon. Everything is an emergency. And that's why in our certification courses, we've added time management as an assist, but it's hard. And so this is where organizations like NASCIO and PTI can help by at least showing demonstration projects, bringing new applications to the attention of our technology-minded members. That's where associations can shine, because others are so afraid to open the doors to vendors. It's like, well, how do I know if I have this person in that I'm closing the door to somebody else? No one's going to sell somebody else's product. So they need to have an unbiased view of what's available in any area, what is possible. This is a huge leadership dilemma that faces local government. And that's why I'm hoping that if we have these regional kind of structures where people are talking together on a more routine basis, with cyber as kind of the unifying factor that brings everyone together, that these discussions will happen. And we can talk about scale. We can talk about maybe utilizing a state data center or using a larger county data center when you have a small town. It's already happening, but it's not happening enough.
Yeah, good points. Got a question here from Rock about which I've actually had questions from some folks already in the media about respect to governments attracting laid off tech workers. Anecdotally, not a lot. My kind of prognostication is I don't see it happening, simply because of the couple of things. One is the dramatic gaps in compensation between those workers. Even though they're laid off, I think they're going to hang around and wait for something to rebound rather than go to the public sector. We've certainly seen that happen in the past. Certainly during 2008 and 9, we had states that were flipping contractors, but they were already working for the states. They're moving them into civil service positions. So that's happened back in 2001, 2002 with a lot of states, but then those are very small numbers. I think the other part of that, and it gets to the point of the difficulty of states trying to attract candidates, is that these folks are used to what I would consider to be a much more flexible work environment, both in terms of location as well as scheduling. And that's something, as I say, you rarely find state government and flexibility in the same sentence. And so I think that's something that's really has to be impressed upon state leaders. I know the state HR and personnel executives, they understand that, but their hands are tied often by their policies and administrative rules about what they can do. But if you look at the marketplace, the number one thing that most IT candidates want is a flexible work environment, scheduling and location. Those are two things that our own data shows less than a quarter of the states are able to allow that in one way or a meaningful way or another. So that's the real rub. I don't see those folks being interested in state government at this point.
And I think the same would be true for local government, although I was at a CompTIA meeting earlier today, and it was said that despite all these corporate layoffs that we're hearing about, which certainly get a lot of attention, most tech jobs today are in these smaller firms, and they are crying for people. So my guess is that those who have been displaced are going to gravitate to the private sector. They may go to a smaller company, maybe get some stock options, get the flexibility they're looking for, because some of these smaller companies are geared to do that. And their last resort would be going to a local or state government as a result.
Quick question here. When do you expect cyber grants will actually be available? I like that phrase, Steve, actually be available. Well, I mean, so the CISA has to review and approve the plans for the states that have been submitted. A number of states have already submitted their plans. So once they're approved, then there will be obviously a cycle of disbursement for each of those states. And then each state administrative agency, the SAA for each group, which is not the CIO organization, it's not the CIO or state CISO, they will be responsible for making the determination. The committee, the state committee, will be the ones that determine how that process goes. The states may determine that they are in fact going to use funds to deliver enterprise shared services in lieu of doing discrete pass down. There may be a mix of that. So states are really working through that. Some states have determined that they are simply going to have an application process for the locals to apply for those dollars. Other states have said, no, we're actually going to look at the opportunities here to deliver things like, we already have a cybersecurity training platform. We're going to make that available to our locals as part of this grant program. So they do have that option in lieu of option in the bill, in the act that gives them the opportunity to do it. So all those things will be determined. So we're months away from real dollars, I think, being on the streets to the local governments in terms of their subrecipient status. So it still to be determined, and every state may approach it differently. But I think for the most part, I see a hybrid for a lot of states where they will do a mix of, we're going to deliver X, and again, to my commentary, which is not a NASCIO policy position, my commentary is that the states and the locals really need to focus on assessing their environment before they start buying bright shiny objects. So that's my concern with the grant, is that the local, needs to be an assessment program to assess the risk, do that risk assessment, document the risk, and say, this is how we're going to invest in the future, rather than simply having locals buy technology. So I think there's a pretty big gap there. So we'll see how the states work that out in the political process.
And each state committee is different. My great fear also, and I totally agree with Doug, is that more money may go for local government, but not to local government. So, for those looking to local governments to say, hey, I'm looking for this, it may not happen. It may actually reside at the state, this committee, whatever group they're forming. And my fear is that very little money will go to the locals. And maybe that's good if they can't justify it. But my hope is, I'm an optimist. I think they could do a very good job. They've had a year to plan. We've been telling them, plan ahead. What is your wish list, and rational why? And then prioritize. So shame on any local government that didn't take advantage of that year, which was a very long wait. But now we're going to see how this all shakes out, and it's going to be very interesting. So I think we're out of time, Doug. Right.
I think we are, sir. We had a little more time this year in this cycle to get to questions. I know a lot of questions on broadband, and so certainly look at the NASCIO state CIO survey, where we talk about the role of the CIO and broadband and funding and some of the most important challenges facing the states in that area. But it's something that has really changed over the last 15 to 20 years in terms of the CIO role. So it's diminished pretty dramatically across the states. So,
Great.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I want to thank everyone. And I know there were some people who came in a couple of minutes late. Yes, you will get a link to this as a recording. You'll get the transcript, the slide, whatever you need. We want to get the word out. That's our job. And we love doing this. And if all goes as planned, we'll do our mid-year little chat that we usually do in July. And we actually allow more time for discussion in that format. So I wish everyone a happy new year as we proceed, and we'll see how close we are to the mark with the predictions that we have made. Doug?
Yes. Thank you, Alan. I want to thank everyone for your time today. We appreciate you joining us for this commentary. We always try to bring you as much valuable information and insights as we can, and we know that helps all of you in terms of addressing your needs with your particular governments or your customers in the public sector. So we appreciate you tuning in and listening to us go on about all this. We have a good time.
We do.
Okay.
Signing off from the Doug and Alan Show. Until next
Got it.
time. Have a good
Got
one.
it.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.